There's a specific kind of quiet that happens right before you make a decision that will ruin your life or save it. I'm still not sure which one it was for me. I was standing on the corner of Birdcage Walk, just where it curves away from St. James's Park, on a Tuesday in October that couldn't decide if it wanted to be autumn or not. The trees were half committed, some leaves gone amber, some still green, and holding on like they hadn't gotten the memo. The sky was doing that thing it does in London, where it isn't quite gray and isn't quite white. Just pale, like old paper left near a window. My bag was at my feet. Not a tourist bag, not a camera-around-the-neck bag. A procession. The kind you pack when you are not planning to come back for a while. One change of clothes, because you couldn't think beyond one day. A book you'll never finish. Your passport, because something in you needed the weight of it. I hadn't eaten since the night before. I want to tell you that's because I was dramatically suffering. It wasn't. Il est juste fouruten. You do that when your brain is occupied with eating itself. I was trying to remember why I had come to this corner specifically, and I genuinely couldn't. I'd walked out of the flat on Pimlico Road at 9:30 in the morning, told myself I was going to get a coffee, and somehow ended up here, passport and bag at feet, standing on a pavement, watching a pigeon attempt to eat a flattened crisp packet, and failing completely. The pigeon was very committed to the crisp packet. I respected it. My phone had 17 unread messages. I knew this without checking because I'd watched them arrive, one by one, the little screen lighting up against my thigh through my coat pocket. My mother, my manager, a person whose name I'd saved as do not answer 3 months ago and never explained to anyone, including myself. I didn't read them. Here is what I was thinking about instead. I was thinking about a conversation I'd had with my father 2 years earlier, right before he got sick, when we'd been sitting in the garden of his house in Shropshire on one of those freakish warm September evenings that England occasionally produces like a magic trick. He'd been drinking lager from a can, which he never did. He was a proper glass man, and I'd asked him about it, and he'd said, "I'm 71. I'm allowed to drink from a can if I want." And I'd laughed, and he'd laughed, and then there'd been this silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just real. The kind of silence two people can only have when they've stopped performing for each other. He'd said, out of nothing, "You should go, you know, while you still want to." I thought he meant on holiday. Standing on Birdcage Walk with my bag between my feet and a pigeon failing at a crisp packet, I was fairly certain he hadn't meant on holiday. He'd been dead for 11 months. I wasn't grieving exactly, but it had gone so deep it wasn't visible anymore. It was more like, wait, like everything I did was happening at the bottom of something. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just heavy, always, in a way I couldn't point to. The leaving idea had started about 6 weeks before the Tuesday on the corner. It had started the way most serious ideas start, as a joke. I've been on the phone to my friend Priya, complaining about work, about the flat, about the thing with the person saved as do not answer, and she'd said, half laughing, "Why don't you just go? Like, just actually go somewhere. Start over." And I'd said, "You're right." And then I'd lain awake until 3 in the morning thinking about it. By week 2, I'd looked up Portugal, then Morocco, then, embarrassingly, I'd spent 40 minutes reading about the cost of living in Tbilisi, Georgia, which I knew nothing about except that it was somewhere that was not here. By week 4, I'd started the bag. Not packing it, just having it. I'd taken an old duffel from the top of the wardrobe and put on the chair in the corner of the bedroom, and occasionally I'd look at it. Sometimes before sleep, sometimes first thing in the morning, just to know it was there. Week 6 was the Tuesday. I don't know why Tuesday felt different. I'd woken up, and the flat had felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not haunted. Just the way a coat feels when you've been wearing it so long you've stopped noticing it fits badly. The specific wrongness of a life that has been worn for too long, without alteration. So I'd taken the bag from the chair. And here I was. The pigeon gave up on the crisp packet. It walked away with tremendous dignity, as though it had simply lost interest. As though the crisp packet had ceased to deserve its attention. I picked up my bag. Put it down again. Picked it up. The actual question I was trying to answer on that corner was not should I go. I've been answering that one for 6 weeks, and the answer kept coming back the same. The question was what happens to the people you leave behind. Not dramatically, Not accusingly, just factually. My mother, who called twice a week on Sunday mornings and had never once said I need you, but said it every other way. My job, which was mediocre and exhausting and which 3 other people depended on because our team was underfunded and always had been. The flat itself, which had a leak in the bathroom that the landlord had been ignoring for 4 months and which would worsen over winter into something structural. None of these were reasons to stay. I knew this. I also knew that knowing something and being able to act on it are 2 entirely different species of knowledge. I was standing there, bag in hand this time, not at feet which felt like progress, working through the specific geometry of this problem, the math of departure, when I heard it. Not drums. Not yet. Something else first. A hush. That is the only way I can describe it. A hush that moved through the street the way a breeze moves, not all at once, but in a wave starting somewhere behind me and washing forward. The scatter of tourists near the park gates slowing. Conversations dropping to nothing. A child who had been loudly explaining something to his father suddenly, stopping mid-syllable. And then someone said it, quietly, almost to themselves. Oh, the procession. I turned to want to tell you that the procession was announced. That we'd known. That there were barriers already up and police on horseback and all the ceremonial machinery of official spectacle already in place. There was none of that. This was, and I checked later because I needed to confirm I hadn't imagined it, a completely unscheduled movement. An internal royal convoy, the kind that doesn't make it to the tourist calendars, doesn't get the full ceremonial treatment. Just the household cavalry outriders on their dark horses and the cars and the flag and all the specific gravity that travels with that flag wherever it goes. But you can't really call it unannounced. Not when you have lived in the city long enough to understand how it announces itself. The hush announces it. Every single time. London is the loudest city I have ever lived in, and I have lived in 3 and visited enough to have a qualified opinion. It is loud in the deep structural way, the way cities are loud when they have been continuously inhabited for 2,000 years and have never quite stopped moving. The buses. The underground ventilation shafts. The specific frequency of argument that rises from any pub on a Friday. The sirens. Always sirens. But when something royal passes through, even something small, even something unofficial, London does this thing. It goes quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of attention. I have never been able to fully explain it to people who haven't experienced it. It is not reverence exactly. It's more like the city recognizing something in itself. Some thread that connects the pavement I was standing on to every other occasion something important has passed along it. The city has muscle memory. It remembers. The hush came first. Then the sound of hooves. Not rhythmic the way you imagine from films. More organic. More heavy. 4 hooves each, the cavalry horses, and the sound came around the corner before the horses did. So for a long moment the street was full of the sound of something you couldn't see yet, and the tourists who had gathered along the edge of the pavement were holding their phones up into this sound, recording nothing but sky and the gray October air. I still had my bag in my hand. I am fairly certain I had stopped thinking about leaving. Not consciously. It wasn't a decision. The thought had simply paused. The way music pauses between movements. Not finished. Suspended. The first outrider came around the corner. Household cavalry. Tall horse, coat like a well-polished boot, dark and slightly impractical looking in the middle of a Tuesday morning. The rider in the silver breastplate, the helmet with a white plume, the absolute physical stillness that these men maintain on horseback in the middle of living, moving London. He did not look at us. He looked through us, which is different. His eyes were fixed at some middle distance that existed only for him, some private horizon that is part of the training. You look at a thing that is not there, so that all the things that are there cannot distract you. A woman beside me said, "Oh my God," not loudly, not performatively, just to herself, just because she needed to say something. Behind the first outrider, 2 more, and then a gap, timed exactly, and then the first car. I was standing close enough to the road. There were no barriers, remember, that I could hear the engine, could see through the window, or almost. The glass was the tinted kind, but not entirely, and what you got was the impression of a figure rather than a figure itself. The shape of someone seated upright, the posture of a person who has spent their entire life understanding that their posture is being observed. The flag was on the front of the car. I don't have strong feelings about the monarchy, politically. That is not what this is about. I want to be clear about that. I grew up in a household where my mother thought it was all harmless heritage, and my father thought it was an outdated constitutional embarrassment, and neither of them argued about it very hard, and I'd landed somewhere in the middle the way children of balanced arguments always do. Mildly ambivalent, not moved by it on paper, but the flag. The flag moving through London, slowly, with the horses in front and the police behind, does something to you that your politics can't fully account for. Because it is not about the politics. It is about the fact that the flag has been moving through this city, through streets that have changed every decade around it, through wars and plagues and rebuilding and loss. And here it still is on a Tuesday in October while a pigeon fails at a crisp packet, and a 34-year-old man stands on the pavement with his whole life in a bag, trying to decide whether to leave. Here it still is. The car passed. Then another. Then 2 more outriders. The whole thing lasted, I checked, less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes. The hush hung for about 30 seconds after the last horse disappeared around the corner toward Buckingham Palace. And then London turned itself back on like a light switch. The buses resumed. The conversations restarted. A child screamed with delight about something unrelated. A black cab leaned on its horn. The tourists lowered their phones. The woman beside me, the one who had said, "Oh my God," looked down at her phone screen, at whatever she'd managed to record, and then looked up at me because I was the nearest available person and said, "Did you know that was going to happen?" I said no. She said it was so, I don't know. It just came out of nowhere. I said, yeah. She said it gave me chills. I didn't say anything to that because I understood it and couldn't explain why I understood it, and the explanation felt too long for a conversation with a stranger on a pavement. She nodded, satisfied with my silence in the way people are sometimes satisfied by the recognition of shared experience even without the words for it, and walked away toward the park. I stood there. My bag was still in my hand. Here is what had happened while the procession passed, and this is the part one have trouble explaining without sounding like I'm turning it into something it wasn't. Nothing. Literally nothing happened. No revelation. No sign. No message delivered from the universe through the medium of a royal convoy. The procession was not about me. It was not for me. It had its own destination, its own logic, its own history entirely separate from mine. I was simply there on the corner, and it passed, and that was all. But the thought had paused, and when the thought came back, when I became aware that I was still standing on Birdcage Walk, bag in hand, same problem as before, same math of departure unsolved, it came back differently. Not smaller, not resolved, just located somewhere new inside me, like it had been moved to a different room in the house. I stood on the corner for another full minute and a half, which sounds brief, but is a long time to stand on a pavement with a bag and nothing to look at. A man in a suit walked around me twice, specifically giving me the wide berth that Londoners give to people who are standing still on pavements for reasons they cannot immediately identify. Fair enough. I put the bag down. Not permanently. Not as a decision. Just to rest my hand. My phone lit up again. My mother again. Not do not answer. My mother, who had been calling twice on Sundays since before I understood what Sundays meant, who had never once moved cities, who had stayed in the same house for 37 years, and repainted the kitchen 3 times, and kept the same route to the same supermarket, because she had decided at some point that familiarity was not a consolation prize. It was the prize. I thought about picking up. I didn't, but I thought about it, which was more than I'd been doing all morning. There was an old man who had watched the procession from a folding stool. I didn't notice him during, I was too occupied with my own private geography, but I noticed him after, when London had switched back on and I was standing there failing to make any kind of decision. He was sitting about 15 feet to my left, against the park railing, on one of those lightweight aluminum camping stools that old men carry without irony. He had a thermos. He had a pair of gloves that didn't match, one brown, one dark blue, and a cap with no particular affiliation on it, just a cap, gray and soft from a decade of being a cap. He was looking in the direction the procession had gone with an expression I couldn't name. Not wistful, not nostalgic, something quieter than either of those. The expression of a man watching something that has already happened, still happening inside him. I don't know why I spoke to him. I'm not the type to speak to strangers on pavements. In London specifically, it is understood that you do not speak to strangers on pavements. It is one of the city's organizing principles. You share buses and tubes and entire mornings with hundreds of people at skin-close distance, and you look at your phone or the middle distance, and you do not make eye contact, and you certainly do not begin conversations. But I walked the 15 feet, and I said, "Did you know it was coming?" He looked at me. He had very pale eyes, the kind that look younger than the rest of the face. Roughly, he said, "You learn the patterns, not the schedules, just the feeling of the city when something's about to move through it." I said, "How long have you been coming out for these?" He considered this with the seriousness it didn't strictly require. 40-odd years, he said. Started when I was about your age. Maybe younger. Every time? Most times. Not all. He looked back toward the corner where the horses had gone. Missed a few when I was abroad. Regretted it. Started coming more regularly after that. I sat down on the pavement beside his stool, which was not something I planned to do. My bag was in my lap. It was a ridiculous position, a grown man cross-legged on a London pavement, but I was past caring about looking ridiculous, and he didn't seem to mind. "Why?" I said. "What is it about them?" He didn't answer immediately. He poured something from the thermos into the lid cup and held it in both hands. Steam rose into the cold morning. "My wife asked me that once," he said. "She thought it was odd. Royalist in a way she wasn't." He paused. "It isn't about that." I told her it isn't about that, and she believed me, but she wasn't sure she understood. "What is it about then?" He thought again. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which is rarer than it should be. "You know those moments," he said, "when you realize you are in the middle of something that doesn't care about you at all. Not unkindly. Just doesn't include you. It's going to happen whether you're here or not. Whether you're paying attention or not. It'll pass, and then it'll pass again in 10 years, and then again, and the city will do that quiet thing, and you won't be there for some of them, but it'll do it anyway." He drank from the thermos cap. "I find that settling," he said. "Is that the word? Settling. The way a house settles. Nothing wrong with it. Just finding its level." I said, "Yes, that's the word." He glanced at my bag. Not pointedly, not nosily, just the way eyes move when they're taking in the full picture of a person. "Going somewhere," he said, thinking about it. The contained an entire conversation I couldn't have had without it. It had in it the particular understanding of someone who has been young enough to be on that specific corner of decision, the place where you're holding the weight of going and the weight of staying, and neither one is heavier yet. The of someone who has been there. Not advice in it, not judgment, just recognition. We sat in silence for a moment that was longer than strangers usually allow. Then, he said, "First time I thought about going properly, I was 29. Job had gone bad. Relationship had gone worse. Father had died the year before." I looked at him. I stood in Victoria Station with a bag. Not dissimilar to that one. A nod toward my bag. Had a ticket to Brussels, which seems like an odd choice now, but at the time felt like the right distance. Far enough to mean something. Close enough to feel possible. What happened? "A pigeon flew into the departure board," he said. "Made this enormous noise." Everyone looked up. The board flipped over all at once, those old mechanical ones with the tiles, and for about 4 seconds every destination on it was scrambled. Just letters. No words. Then, it resolved back into the correct information. He smiled at his thermos. I don't know why that stopped me. It was nothing. A bird and a mechanical process. But I stood there for a long time after, and then I missed my train, and then I went back out through the ticket hall and got on the tube home. "Do you regret it?" The pale eyes came back to me. "Every version of that question is the wrong question," he said. "Regret isn't really. It assumes a different version of you made the other choice. But you'd have been a different person by the time you arrived at whatever the other choice became. Regret is for decisions, not for lives." I didn't have anything to say to that. He stood up from his stool, folding it with the practiced ease of a man who has folded it many times. He screwed the lid back on the thermos. What I will say, he said, buttoning his coat, is that going doesn't require an occasion and staying doesn't require justification. They're just things you do, like the procession, like the quiet. It happens whether you're ready or not. He tucked the stool under his arm. Good luck, he said. Either way. He walked toward the park gate and through it and was within about 30 seconds, invisible among the trees and the half-committed autumn and the pale October light. I stayed on the pavement for a long time after. Long enough that the cold worked its way through my coat. Long enough that the park filled with lunchtime people. Office workers with sandwiches, a woman with a pram, 2 teenagers on scooters who shouldn't have been in the park. Long enough that the light shifted, that London-specific shift from pale morning to pale afternoon. The sun making its low, unconvincing attempt at warmth. I thought about my father, the lager can, the garden. You should go, while you still want to. I thought about the flag, moving through the city going quiet for it, the city resuming. I thought about the old man with the mismatched gloves who had stood in Victoria Station at 29 and missed a train and gone home. I thought about the pigeon, which had walked away from the crisp packet with such tremendous dignity. Here's what I decided. Nothing. I decided absolutely nothing on that corner, which is possibly the truest thing I can tell you about what happened. The decision was not made on Birdcage Walk on a Tuesday in October. It was not made by a royal procession or a wise stranger or a grief that had gone so deep it looked like weight instead of sadness. I picked up my bag. I walked not toward Victoria, not toward the flat on Pimlico Road, but laterally along the park under the committed trees and the uncommitted trees past the pelicans that live in St. James's Park and look at everything with ancient disdain past the tourists feeding them bread they should not be feeding them, past the bandstand, past the cafe with its overpriced coffee that I stopped at and bought anyway because I hadn't eaten since the night before, and some things are simply practical. I sat at a table outside the cafe with the coffee and a cheese roll and my bag and my phone with its 17 messages, and I ate, and I didn't read the messages, and the pale October light pressed down softly on everything. The decision came 3 weeks later. I went. Not Brussels. Not Tbilisi. Not Morocco. Not Portugal. Somewhere I hadn't considered at all until a friend mentioned it offhand. Somewhere that made no particular symbolic sense, and therefore made every kind of practical sense the way real decisions usually do. I came back 14 months after that. Not because I had to, because I wanted to, which it turns out is the only good reason to come back from anywhere. My mother asked me, the week after I returned, if I'd been running away. I thought about the corner, the bag at my feet, the pigeon and its dignity, the hush before the horses. I said no. I was figuring out what I was running toward. She said, "Did you find out?" I said, "Mostly." She said, "Good enough," and made tea, and that was the end of that conversation. I walked past Birdcage Walk again last spring. Habit, maybe. The kind of route you walk without deciding to. The corner looked exactly the same. Of course it did. The railing where the old man had set his stool. The stretch of pavement. The park gate. London does not memorialize the private occasions. It keeps no record of the weight you carried there, the bag you set down, the procession you watched with your whole abandoned morning. It simply continues, as it has always continued, loud and pale and inhabited. But when I stood there for a moment, just a moment, the traffic moved, the tourists moved, a pigeon made its attempt on something it found on the pavement, and underneath all of it, through the 2,000 years of noise, I thought I heard it. The faintest hush. The city recognizing itself.